Support for WUWM podcasts comes from Potawatomi Casino Hotel Milwaukee, home to 24/7 excitement, dining, and an on-site hotel at 1721 West Canal Street. More information at potawatomi.com.
From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Today, we'll learn why graduating students at Marquette are pushing back on the university's choice of commencement speaker. Then, in a new Capitol Notes, we'll look at what recent announcements from Wisconsin legislative Republicans may signal about what's ahead this election year.
The election is not today, right? It's in November. But this environment needs to improve between now and then for Republicans to have a better chance of holding the Senate, holding the Assembly, winning the governor's office. And right now, there's a feeling of kind of like this is not the best environment, right, for Republicans to be running in.
Plus, we'll speak with a local photographer about his first photobook dedicated to live music in Milwaukee.
I think this is a great way for me to not necessarily close a chapter, but honor a part of the journey that got me to where I am as an artist and as a Milwaukeean, as someone who advocates for art and culture here.
All that's coming up on Lake Effect. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Thanks for joining us today. Commencement is just around the corner for thousands of college students in Milwaukee. At Marquette, some students are pushing back after the university announced that its graduation speaker for this May will be Chris Duffy. He's the head of AI products and platforms at Adobe. To understand student reaction, WUWM education reporter Catherine Kokel spoke with Elena Mentonides, a reporter at Marquette's student newspaper who gathered reactions from students.
Okay, so last month, Marquette University announced its graduation proceedings, including the graduation speaker, Chris Duffy. Elena, can you tell me a little bit about some of the student feedback that you heard in your reporting?
Definitely. I was pleased to see how many students wanted to speak with me about this. A big consensus was that, okay, these are seniors. They've been at Marquette for 4 years. They've worked very hard, and their next step is to go into the workforce. And what we're seeing with all these entry-level jobs being taken or changed by AI, everyone was definitely worried about having a speaker that it works so closely with AI and that is speaking to them at their graduation when they're about to maybe struggle to find jobs, next week after they graduate. So that was a big consensus, was we've worked so hard and now we're struggling, but Marquette is platforming this AI leader. There were no initial good reactions from students. I will say, like, one of the things, hence the title of the piece, I got 4 separate times that it's a slap in the face. So that was a huge eye-opener for me to hear that from 4 separate students out of, I think, the 8 that I interviewed. So half. Long story short, those were the reactions that I got initially.
Yeah, that's the type of quote that once you hear it over and over again as a reporter, you're like, yep, that's the headline, right?
Right.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the students you talk to are specifically concerned about the impact of AI on entry-level jobs, which is what college graduates are going for. But you do point out that this doesn't seem to be specific to Chris Duffy and his work at Adobe, but more AI and platforming AI in general, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say students had no idea who Chris Duffy was before this announcement, so their feelings are not directed at him. They are not attacking him. They're definitely now raising questions about his work for sure and what he stands for. They're definitely looking into it now, but their feelings and their opinions that they expressed with me for this story specifically were very much centered around Marquette's decision and the decision to platform AI or someone who is closely related to AI. They didn't care so much that it was Duffy who is related to AI, but just that someone so closely working with AI is their graduation speaker.
So it's worth mentioning that Marquette has said that Duffy will bring a, quote, unique perspective to graduates that are entering an unprecedented landscape of technological advancement and ethical dilemmas. That is kind of the university's response to student concerns about this. You dug in a little bit to Chris Duffy and his past. Can you share a little bit about who he is and particularly his book?
Yeah, definitely. So Chris Duffy, like you mentioned, is the global head of AI and agentic systems at Adobe. And he is also a Marquette alum. So part of what Marquette takes into consideration when they decide a speaker is their impact on society and their engagement with Marquette. So they feel that, this Marquette alum, he has notable efforts in this developing field. And so Marquette's thinking is that he is a good voice for students to understand how to use AI and technology ethically. But his book, it's called Superhuman Innovation. It was actually published in 2019, which is really interesting because generative AI didn't really skyrocket until 2022 with ChatGPT. But it's the first book about AI that's also co-authored by AI. It's basically about system level integration and human oversight with like kind of human machine collaboration and thinking and reasoning. And that's what the premise of the book is all about.
Yeah, really, really interesting. I'm going to take a second to reintroduce you here. Today we're talking with a reporter from the Marquette Wire, Elena Metanidis. Obviously, a lot of the student feedback that you got was negative. I wanted to kind of pull back the curtain for a second to just ask, you're a sophomore this year at Marquette. What is it like going to college where large language models are so prevalent?
Yeah, definitely. It's really interesting because ChatGPT and AI have been at the forefront of my college career so far because ChatGPT became popular my junior and senior year of high school. So like all of college I've known with the presence of AI. And so I think that's really interesting because I'm not only learning how to deal with college classes and how they differ from high school, but also what it means to have AI in the mix of that. I mean, student opinions and like usage of AI are honestly all over the place. There are some people who are completely anti, never touch it, mostly for ethical reasons. And then there's people who use it all the time for any purpose, school related or not, just with it's becomes a search engine for a lot of people. Or there's people in the middle, which is I think where I fall, which is like, okay, if I like it's interesting. It's definitely interesting to use it to see what it comes up with. I obviously value higher education. I'm at a good school that I care about a lot, and so I avoid using it for educational purposes or class purposes. But I do, dabble in it, of course, because it's such an interesting technology. And I think it's very innovative. But we also have to be careful about like all of the ethical implications and everything with like the environment and just morals, of like human thinking and all of that.
You also point out in your story that Marquette doesn't have a blanket policy for AI usage by students, right? It kind of varies by instructor.
Yeah, it definitely varies a lot. Every student has to complete like agreement of no plagiarism or cheating or some code of conduct of like we pledge to be honest about our work and whatnot. So there's that, but there's no policy on AI that's university wide. And, this came up a lot in this story that students think it's very odd that there's no AI policy for the university, but they're making such a huge statement with this speaker who's closely tied to AI. So students just were very confused because Marquette doesn't have a stance on AI as a university. But so, yeah, professors are kind of all over the board with AI. Some are very strict with extreme repercussions. It's, if you're caught using it, if your paper has any flag of AI, like often either that individual has consequences or sometimes the whole class does. What I mean by class consequences is like if there's a case where AI seems to be used, and this has happened in probably most of my classes, where if one student seems to be using AI on a paper or something like that, the whole class has to now put in new measures to make sure that we are not using AI, whether that's writing a paper in class on actual pen and paper, or whether that's running it through a professor's like AI detector whether that's putting in a statement at the end of your paper being like, I acknowledge that I didn't use AI. There's that end where it's super strict. There's the middle ground where, they say, do not use it for your original content, like don't use it for papers and such, but I will allow you to like generate ideas or think about source ideas, but not for original creation. And then you have the other end where I've had a professor that is all for AI. They want us to practice using it to see, what it means in our world, how to like identify its strengths and weaknesses, how to use it in different scenarios, what it means to work with AI in these times as a student, as a future professional. And they're like all for it. Just be transparent about it. Like if you used it, just tell me. So it's very all over the place. And so as a student, especially when the semester starts, like it's weird to get all of the different feedback from professors where one says, I will not allow it at all. One says, it's fine, but like you have to take the right steps, or free range. So it's very interesting because you just have to remember what professor wants what and what they're okay with and what the overall course calls for.
Wow, an area where technology is just changing so quickly that you might go through a day with 3 different classes, 3 different professors, and 3 different stances on AI. That's really interesting. Well, now is a good time for me to remind people you should read Elena's piece. It's available at marquettewire.org. Marquette University's graduation is going to be in early May. I actually will be there. A member of my family is graduating, so we will see what Chris says. Thanks so much for coming on to talk to me about this, Elena. It was really great reporting.
Thank you so much for taking the time to meet and for highlighting the story.
Elena Mentonitas is a reporter at Marquette Wire. She spoke with WUWM education reporter Catherine Kokel. Chris Duffy and Adobe have not responded to a request for comment. Marquette University is a financial supporter of WUWM.
This is Capital Notes from Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Maayan Silver, speaking with J.R. Ross, editor of WisPolitics.com. Hi, J.R. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So we've got midterm elections this year, and the full state assembly and half the state senate are up for grabs. This election is happening under new legislative maps that went into effect in 2024, which don't favor Republicans as much. Last week, there were some announcements from Senate Republicans who said they aren't running for re-election, including Devin LeMahieu, the Senate Majority Leader from Oostburg. What do we need to know here?
Well, there are a couple of things. A lot of it's being driven by personal reasons. For example, Van Wangard is a Republican from Racine. Since he ran 4 years ago, 3 of his siblings have passed away. A 4th who has dementia had a heart attack, and his daughter has been diagnosed with cancer. That's a lot, right? And Van said that his heart, he wanted to run, but he knew he couldn't do it and just decided it was time to not seek re-election. For Devin LeMahieu, being leader has been difficult. That caucus is a challenge to manage quite often. And it seemed like a relief for him in some ways to not have to do it anymore. So definitely some personal reasons involved with these retirements. But when you look at him collectively, you kind of go, this is not sending a great message for Republicans about what they think of their chances for this fall. Look, right now we're in a period where Donald Trump numbers are not doing very well. There is a war going on in Iran. Gas prices are going up. And please know that's not the biggest thing in the world when you talk about lives being at risk in a theater of war. But let's face it, that's the impact that we're feeling for a lot of us at home. That's not helping the environment for Republicans who typically, if your party is in power in the White House, you struggle in midterm elections. So the election is not today, right? It's in November. But this environment needs to improve between now and then for Republicans to have a better chance of holding the Senate, holding the Assembly, winning the governor's office. And right now there's a feeling of kind of like this is not the best environment, right, for Republicans to be running in.
And how do the decisions of these legislators to not run again tie into the new maps, or don't you think that's an influence at all?
For Wongard, of these retirements, he has the biggest swing seat. It's slight edge to Democrats there. Kamala Harris got more votes than Donald Trump in 2024. Rob Hutton in his seat, suburban Milwaukee, Republican, he's not running again. That was a +6 seat for Harris in 2024. So, it might have played a factor in some ways, but again, for Wongard, it was obvious there was a lot of personal stuff going on that made it impossible for him in his mind to run. He definitely wanted to, and he sent signals he was trying to get back in there and run again. But you add all those things up, it's just too much to kind of go through. The rest of the seats so far for Republicans, they're pretty safe in the assembly. Kevin Peterson, the Assembly Pro Tem, he's not running. It's a very Republican seat. Rick Gundrum, the Slinger area, Republican seat. Robin Vos, Assembly Speaker, longest serving Speaker of Wisconsin history. His seat's deep red. Those aren't really at play this fall at this moment.
And in the state Senate in particular, currently Republicans have a really narrow majority there, 18-15. With all these incumbent Republicans not seeking re-election, what does that mean for Democrats' efforts to take control there?
Well, it definitely improves them. I mean, look, there are 4 seats in play, 3 of them held by Republicans, 1 by a Democrat. Democrats have to win any combination of those 3 to have the majority come November. Now, if I go seat by seat, I can tell you where there's a path for a Republican to win. But that path is widened if you have an incumbent in there. Rob Hutton is not running. Van Wongard is not running. That makes it more challenging. You still have Howard Markline, who's the co-chair of the Finance Committee from Spring Green. He's seeking re-election in a southwestern Wisconsin seat. You've got an interesting race up in the Eau Claire area where Jeff Smith, a Democrat, is the incumbent, but Jesse James is also an incumbent. The new maps drew him into a different district. He moved kind of temporarily into his district he was elected to in 2022. He's not going to run the district where his house remains, his permanent residence. So you've got an incumbent election. You can see where a Republican can win, that you can make an argument for it. But again, if you take a 30,000-foot view, you go, okay, if I add up Trump's numbers, gas prices, conflicts overseas, discontent at home with various things, and these incumbents not running, it paints a not great picture for Republicans when it comes to how this fall is going to look. As we sit here today, I stress that, as of today. We'll see how it looks come October if things change.
And as we mentioned in the Senate, there's that 18-15 majority for Republicans right now, so they can only lose 1 caucus member on a bill without needing Democratic support. And some people have insisted that the majority party should only pass legislation if there's enough support from the caucus to avoid relying on votes from the minority party, which is in this case Democrats. That's called the Rule of 17. How has this influenced lawmaking in recent years in the state Senate?
Well, that rule is interesting because it's been selectively enforced, number one, and it's not really like a hard, fast rule that like everybody lives up to it. Actually, Devin LeMahieu, the outgoing majority leader, his office gave me a spreadsheet that had, going back to 2003-04, every session, how many bills passed with less than 17 votes from the majority party. There were a lot of them, dozens of them. The only session in where no bills passed with less than 17 votes from the GOP, from the majority, was 21-22, Devin's first session as leader. But it got a lot of attention this year because of 2 bills, really. One, changed the definition of an online bet to fit, current statutes for what's allowed as a bet. That enables the governor then to negotiate with the tribes on allowing online gaming so long as the bet goes to a server on tribal lands. That one passed with 9 Senate votes, Senate GOP votes. And then a name, image, and likeness bill with the University of Wisconsin where the Madison campus would get $15 million a year to pay for the cost of athletic facilities. That would then free up money to pay athletes in these NIL deals. That got 11 GOP votes. So much higher bar there in terms of needed support from the minority party than usual. But it's not been unheard of for bills to pass without 17 votes in the chamber, regardless of the leader's been.
This is Capital Notes. I'm Maayan Silver, speaking with J.R. Ross of WizPolitics.com. So what does that mean for bipartisanship in the state Senate? Have we seen a lot more of it in recent years?
Oh, good question. They've worked together on some big things to get some things done. I mean, we have the Milwaukee Brewers Stadium, for example, doing an overhaul of shared revenue. Like, we've seen negotiations on things. What's been interesting is sometimes in politics, you will hear people talk about how if you have a smaller minority, you actually have a stronger team because the team feels a requirement to row in the same direction, to work together because there are fewer of us, we can't lose somebody and get something done. Then compared to having a bigger majority where any 3 or 4 members could go off of a bill and you'd be fine. Well, Republicans got to 22 votes in the Senate under the old maps that were in place in 2022, and they had the same issue about, what can we get done with this majority? 2024 comes around, new maps, they go down from 22 to 18. The same people were voting no when they were 22 were still voting no at 18. It made life difficult for Leavenhue and the caucus to get things done sometimes when you have a bill, like, for example, last week, one passed 31-2. But there are 2 no votes, both from Republican caucus, so it did not have that 17 magic number on that bill. What do you do in that situation as leader? Do you let 2 people stop a bill that 31 others like, that will get signed into law, that one of your other members in your caucus wants to get done? That's that challenge about enforcing that rule or sticking that rule of thumb when it comes to Rule of 17.
And is Evers more likely to sign these bills because they're bipartisan?
Oh, yeah. We got Democratic support for sure. That definitely helps. I mean, for example, one of the bills that got done this week, they married a change to the food stamp program where they're going to ask for a waiver now, if it's signed, for the federal government to no longer allow food stamps to be used to purchase soda and candy. But they married that with changes that Evers wanted to get additional funding for the Department of Health Services to check the eligibility of people on the program to make sure we don't go above the error rate that would then lose federal money for us. So big bipartisan support, governor's going to sign it. So yes, when you have Democratic votes, it definitely helps the chances of that bill getting signed by the governor.
And can we get a quick civics check right now? What is the role of the state Senate in passing laws? Can you just give a small snapshot of that?
Each bill has to go through both chambers, the exact same language with the majority. So it doesn't matter how it gets done, it matters that it's the same version. Then it goes to the governor for his signature. So neither house has an upper hand in passing things. There's just fewer members in the state Senate.
All right, so what I want to know actually now is about some legislation from last week on PFAS. Essentially, there was some legislative action on that last week. The Wisconsin legislature sent a $133 million plan about contamination from PFAS. They're also called forever chemicals. What can you tell us about this potential end to years of discord between the Democratic governor and Republican lawmakers over the issue?
So back in 23-25, they put $125 million into the budget to cover, these grants to work with PFAS remediation. There was going to be a trailer bill that would actually kind of make it all work. Well, the trailer bill was vetoed by the governor because of a dispute over what's called innocent landowners. People who, for example, didn't put the pollution there, but it's on their property, are they responsible for cleaning it up? Or they spread stuff that was contaminated with PFAS without knowing that it was a problem, or they had a permit when they spread it. So there's all this back and forth about what you do with those folks who maybe necessarily weren't, at fault in a way. That finally got hammered out. That cleared the way for this to get done. And now the package is actually $132 million because at $125 million, interest was added to it over the 2-year period. Now there's more money for these grants.
And Wisconsin villages, towns, cities like Campbell and western Wisconsin have been dealing with PFAS pollution in their groundwater. Essentially, Campbell's 4,300 residents have been drinking bottled water ever since state health officials warned them in 2021 that the wells were contaminated. Did you sense this kind of legislative urgency in the government, or, why was there, you talked a little bit about the gridlock, but overall, why didn't it happen sooner?
Yeah, they wanted to get it done. I mean, the governor had problems with the original language, and they finally had a pressure point, which is the end of this session. They did not want to have this go into next session, the next January, and have to try and do it all over again. So there was a pressure point of the assembly leaving in February that got to hammer out. In fact, the last day of the session We waited for hours as there were people in a room going over the language word by word, comma by comma, to make sure they were on board with how it was worded to everybody's satisfaction and pass the bill.
As always, thanks for this insight into state government, JR, and thanks for joining me on Capitol Notes.
Anytime.
Just like Capitol Notes, Lake Effect is also available as a podcast, so you can listen whenever you like. Find it where you get your podcasts, then subscribe, download, and listen on demand. Ever found yourself waiting to exit the highway until you see a sign for a quick trip?
To someone who's not from here, it might seem like kind of a weird thing that we have this devotion to what looks like just a chain gas station. So we wanted to see what about Quick Trip is particularly Wisconsin and learn a bit more about its history.
We'll learn why so many Wisconsinites often favor Quick Trip over other gas station chains in about 15 minutes. But first, we'll speak with local photographer Sam Regani about his first photo book dedicated to live music captured here in Milwaukee. That's coming up next on Lake Effect on WUWM. You're listening to Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Sam Regani first started photographing Milwaukee musicians and concerts back in 2016. By 2019, he was a full-time photographer and had become as much of a fixture in the local music scene as the artists he was capturing. From Brandi Carlile to Buffalo Nichols, Gani has thousands of images that capture the magic of live music in venues of all sizes. His new photo book, Memories of a Street Cat, is dedicated to this formative chapter of his life. The photo book, published by Daybreak magazine, features almost 400 photos of concert pictures and artist portraits, along with commentary from the artists. Gani joins me now to share more about how his first photo book came together.
The idea was tossed around about 3 years ago, and I finally got to work on it within the last 2 years. Or Tommy Moore, the publisher and producer of the book, got to work on it with me over the last 2 years, and it feels surreal. It feels surreal that it's like something physical is coming out of like so much time of work.
Why did you feel this was the right time or perhaps the right subject to put this out?
Yeah, I think I'm just growing as an artist, as a professional, as a person, and I don't shoot live music as much as I did when I was much younger. And thinking about the book, I realized I'm not even the same person that I was when I started shooting, and I think this is a great way for me to not necessarily close a chapter, but honor a part of the journey that got me to where I am as an artist and as a Milwaukeean, as someone who advocates for art and culture here. So it's a really cool way to just kind of say goodbye to something that I used to do every day.
Yeah, what would you say the ratio is now of like capturing live performances versus when it was pretty much the bread and butter, right? It just kind of snowballed into this was your main beat?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it went from 100% to now it's probably like 25% of what I shoot or less a lot of times. And I wish I could just hang out at the club every night, and shoot, but my back hurts.
It is a lot
I'm
of
getting
standing, a
old.
lot of moving. Well, and you've attended and shot so many performances, and I imagine it was hard to narrow it down, but to name a few of the artists featured in this book, we have Sister Strings, Brandi Carlile, Charmer, Diet Life, Buffalo Nichols, Death Cab for Cutie, Classic. There's so many more. With all the shows, I'm sure all the thousands and thousands of images, how did you even begin to narrow down what you wanted to highlight in Memories of a Street Cat?
Well, that was a lot of me leaning on Tommy to be very objective in choosing the artists and some of the best shots. I did select a handful of artists, specifically myself, and then I had those artists be interviewed by Matt Wild of Milwaukee Record. And that was a really interesting way of me overlapping multiple forms of Milwaukee art together, like music, and then Tommy with the physical photo book my images, and then Matt Wild, who very early on in my career would use my photos for their publication. So outside of me choosing some of those artists that were interviewed by Matt Wild, Tommy did a great job of choosing artists and shots that made the most sense, so were cohesive and created a little bit of a narrative within the book.
Yeah, it's hard when you're so wrapped up into your work, right? Like I can relate to editing down an infinite hole. There's no way to pull
Absolutely.
out.
And after so many years, it was so many photos, and I have my own bias, right? Like I have interpersonal relationships with all these people, and I felt it was necessary to have a third party, to have Tommy Moore really take an objective stance and take the time transparently to sift through thousands of photos to see what made the most sense. So I'm really grateful for his patience in that process. It's something I just admittedly couldn't have done myself.
Is there something that didn't make it into the book that you're still thinking about or is a highlight for you?
There's a handful of artists, and I don't want to say who just to stay completely clean and fair, but there's a handful of artists where I'm like, damn, our paths crossed more than once, and they did deserve a spot in this book. But there were a few personal concessions that I had to make. Just as mementos to myself, like Death Cab for Cutie, like you said, shooting them at Summerfest, or there's Angels and Airwaves, which is a huge part of me as an artist, and that section's probably not going to matter a lot to most of like the viewers, especially the viewers who are there to consume the Milwaukee media part, but that it's such an important chapter of my journey and full circle moment for me as a music lover and as a working artist. So there's a lot of little Easter eggs in the book too, and I just had to sacrifice space. Like the book could only be so big.
Well, and it's still an impressive book and lineup. It's 200 plus pages. And to kind of talk about either the Easter eggs or some of the shots in there, I would love to talk about how your brain works when you're on site doing these projects. How do you work in quote unquote concert mode when you're there to capture photos? Like, do you still find ways to take in the whole experience and be present with the music being played, especially if it's an artist that you're a fan of and that means so much to you? How do you navigate both sides of your brain?
Yeah, I think a lot of photographers or videographers can probably relate that I've seen too much of production, that I'm almost more interested in what's happening on and behind stage than the entire experience itself. Especially at bigger theaters like the Paps, for instance, there's so much going on. There's so many people working behind the stage, and I end up becoming a part of that mix when I'm shooting bigger shows. But my brain really churns off when I'm shooting. I go into the hunt and I get really narrow scoped, and I don't hear things and see things, and I'm just paying attention to the intuition. Is something about to happen? The song is building, the artists are moving in a way that they weren't before, so they're obviously about to do something. Like that's kind of, those calculations are running at milliseconds in my brain. And then if it's an artist that I really care about, like Buffalo Nichols, Garden Home, Sister Strings Classic, I'll take a moment to enjoy one song, and like a light switch, I can just churn it off and be present as a music enjoyer, and then turn it right back on as the song's ending and keep hunting.
With concert photography, I imagine it's one of the most difficult things to be assigned because the lighting changes constantly. And you write a little bit about using low light to your advantage. Can you share more about that process?
Yeah, when I first started shooting, I think having to deal with grainy, low light photos was a part of the limitations of the equipment that I had at the time. So, like any artist, I did my best to solve for those problems. And I spent a lot of time second shooting weddings during this era too, which a lot of wedding venues are very low lit. You can't just start setting up lights in the middle of a wedding, and you have to make do, right? So I think I owe a lot to my younger self of having to creatively solve for all of that. And just like a cat at night, I thought it was a great parallel as a cat dad myself, as an animal lover. When a cat is using low light to its advantage, I did so much of that during concert photography and wedding photography. And you know, there's something important to me about not interrupting the experience of the viewer, whether it is at a wedding or at a concert. So I tend not to use flash. Not that I think it's a bad idea to use flash at shows, but I tend not to use flash. again, I couldn't afford a quality flash when I first started shooting, so it was a part of that limitation as well. And then it just became a part of like my style and my brand. And now when I shoot even the biggest shows, I can adapt to the really good lighting in a way that I may not have been able to if I didn't go through the cutting my teeth phase of my journey.
You mentioned earlier that Matt Wild of Milwaukee Record interviewed some of the artists that are featured in the book. How did it make you feel to read some of those for the first time?
I've only read them once because it was a pretty overwhelming feeling. And I don't know if musicians feel this way about when their record's done. I bet a lot of them are going to disagree with this and say that they listened to the record 1,000 times before it released. But I could only, after I proofed the final copy of the digital copy of the book, I looked at that a lot to make sure that it was ready to be printed. But once I got the physical media and I knew that it was right and that it was ready to be sold, it was really hard to read it because it was a really overwhelming experience. As an artist, I don't get the opportunity to stop and talk to artists that I work with about how it feels for them to work with me. We're always thinking about the next thing and the next thing, or what's happening in the moment. And it's kind of a very vulnerable question to ask too, which is why I'm grateful that Matt got to ask it on my behalf. It made it a lot easier for me to include. So I haven't given a lot of time to those quotes, but I think as the months go by post release, it's going to be something that I can continue to reflect on. And as I get farther away from music photography, I think it'll be a really cool thing to remind myself like the impact that I left with some of these people.
So, with concert photography being your first big artistic chapter here in Milwaukee, how do you reflect on this growth looking back and compiling it for this book? And what do you hope people take away from your journey?
I think looking back on it, I realized how little I had when I started. I was working part-time at the mall when I was shooting shows and weddings, and it was me chipping away at something that I didn't know was so grandiose. I didn't really think I was at the summit of a Mount Everest. I thought I was chipping away at rocks on the beach for fun. And it only became a Mount Everest when I allowed it to, when I saw that it could be. And if there's really anything to take away from the book or my journey and some of the things that I've shared as Easter eggs along the way, it's your hobbies don't have to be hobbies, and your passions are just that. They can define you and they can take you all across the world if you let them, if you're patient enough with yourself, if you're open to collaborating, and if you're open to needing help. I think we all need help when we're following our dreams. And they take time. It took me over 10 years to get to this point, and a lot of that was learning, and I think a lot of failure. I think a lot of people don't understand how much failure goes into success. It's almost every day of failure until you reach that one day of success. And I think as long as you can be honest with yourself and keep picking yourself back up, it's so cliche, but anything is possible.
Memories of a Street Cat officially comes out on March 25th, and you're having a launch party at Cactus Club, which of course means a lot to you. Can you share more about this event?
Yeah, yeah. All the artists on the bill: Living Room, El Sebas, Known Moons, Garden Home, and Classic are all dear friends of mine. I believe in them as artists, as a part of the future of Milwaukee music. The show is free to attend because I started shooting artists for free, and I thought it made sense to close this chapter the same way that it began. I'm paying the artist, but you don't have to. And I think that there's something really special for me about that. Cactus Club is where I cut my teeth in one of the places that I first started shooting live music. I'm the vice president of Cactus Plus, the arts nonprofit, the sister organization of Cactus Club. The place really does mean a lot to me, and it laid the groundwork for me being a working artist. So it just made sense for me to host it there.
Well, Samer, I want to congratulate you on such a momentous occasion, and I'm really glad a lot of your work is just going to be physically accessible in this format. It's a big deal, so I hope you feel the love from the community.
Thank you so much, Audrey. I really appreciate it.
Sam Morgani is a Milwaukee-based photographer and filmmaker. His new photobook, Memories of a Street Cat, comes out tomorrow with a release party at Cactus Club at 7 p.m. featuring 5 local bands. It's free, and you can find more information at wuwm.com. We'll take one more break and then we'll talk about Quick Trip and how the gas station became a beloved Midwest institution. That's next on Lake Effect on Milwaukee's NPR.
I am close behind him. I took the long journey home from iridescent to monochrome.
I need a little bit of everything. Let's go to Quick Trip. Get some gas, get some snacks, grab me some.
This is Lake Effect on WUWM. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. We all pick favorites, favorite shows, books, but how about a favorite gas station? For many in the Midwest, it's Quick Trip. The gas station chain has over 900 locations across the Midwest and has created a cult-like following. But why? What is the big deal with Quick Trip? Archer Marquette is the managing editor at Milwaukee Magazine, and he explored that question for a piece in the magazine. He joins Lake Effect's Excrit Nunez to talk about the history of Quick Trip and what makes it so successful.
To someone who's not from here, it might seem like kind of a weird thing that we have this devotion to what looks like just a chain gas station. Because, there are other chain convenience stores that also inspire followings sort of nationwide. An obvious example recently is Buc-ee's. In Philadelphia, there's Wawa. So we wanted to see what about Quick Trip is particularly Wisconsin and learn a bit more about its history.
So tell me more. Where and how did Quick Trip start? Was it always this gas station / convenience store?
It sort of started as more of just a grocery store, but a really small one. So in 1965, in Eau Claire, the first Quick Trip opened. John Hansen and his wife Donna were operating that first store. They went into business with a local company called Gateway Foods. And that was sort of how the guy who eventually became very much the face of Quick Trip, Don Zietlow, got involved. He sort of grew up as a farm kid near there. And then he started working for Gateway Foods, and he worked his way up, eventually becoming president of the company. But when Gateway's owner, D.B. Reinhardt, got involved with this nascent first Quick Trip location in Eau Claire, that was what sort of brought Don into contact with Quick Trip. Some of the folks at Quick Trip that I interviewed for this story, according to them, Don was giving a presentation at a conference for grocery store owners. And he was telling them sort of this pitch about big box stores are coming in and they're going to put you out of business because they're doing more than you're doing. They're selling more than you're doing. You're going to have to get smaller. You're going to have to become closer to what was then being termed a convenience store, which was still relatively a new business. And according to the story, one of the people in the room said something along the lines of, well, if you know so much, why don't you buy my store? And I guess Don took the challenge and said, yeah, okay. And then he went through with it. He bought the store and then approached the Hansens and D.B. Reinhardt, the owner of Gateway Foods, about folding that into the Quick Trips that had already opened at the time, which I believe at the time were 6 total, all very small, all around Eau Claire. And they entered into an agreement together to split ownership amongst each other and run the new chain, which was just beginning.
Wow, that's all really interesting. What did you learn from the people that you spoke with? Why is Quick Trip so popular today?
Yeah, there's a lot of different factors. Quick Trip has a fresh food program that it launched in the mid-2000s at the time that when gas stations were really suffering from the decline in cigarette sales. That was sort of a cornerstone across the industry for years. And when that went down, Quick Trip decided that it was going to be a place for fresh food. So they ended up sort of building out this really impressive within the industry vertical integration. So if you don't know, Quick Trip owns dairy, it owns its own bakery, it owns all these production facilities, largely in La Crosse, where it makes a bunch of the food that you buy at Quick Trip. And then all the things that they make at their own production facilities are transported by Quick Trip drivers. They go through 2 Quick Trips, they're sold at Quick Trips, and this allows the company to hold sort of control over everything. They can make sure that every location is getting the same sort of level of service, which you're not necessarily going to get at the big chains. And so that sort of consistency is a big part of it. And the uniqueness of having their own branded food sort of sets it apart. Another huge thing, this is something that came up whenever I talked to just like fans of Quick Trip and ask them why they care about this place so much, why they would go to it over other places. It's customer service. Quick Trip really prides itself on being sort of a step above other convenience stores when it comes to the way employees treat people. One very noticeable aspect of that is every time you leave, they're going to say, "See you next time." That's something that every person who works at Quick Trip is trained to say. That's part of what they're trying to do to sort of make the experience as pleasant as possible for people. And a lot of that also has to do just on the business end with more competitive pricing. I spoke to a professor at UW-Madison who explained that when people go to Quick Trip, they're not just paying for, say, a coffee or a donut. They're paying for coffee in a clean, well-lit store where everyone's going to be nice to them and they're going to get in and out quickly, not stuck in a long line. So that level of convenience and friendliness is a huge part of it. And the friendliness also is one of the sort of Wisconsin aspects of it. It's something that they play up a lot in their marketing too, the idea of sort of being a Midwest nice place. They definitely want to sort of market themselves as having a certain sort of small business feel, which obviously can be a little bit ironic because they have, I believe, over 900 locations. I think they just hit 900 earlier this year.
So big theme is quality control and customer service. And you mentioned a couple of names. I was wondering if you could tell me about who previously and currently runs the company. What did you learn about them?
Yeah, so Don Zietlow, who I mentioned earlier, has really been the face of Quick Trip since he became sole owner. Well, the Zietlow family did in 2000. He retired in 2022, and the company was taken over by his son, Scott. But he's very much carried it in the same direction for the past 3 years. One thing that came up when we started reporting on this that's pretty well known, at least among folks who are politically minded, is Don Zietlow is well known as a Republican donor. He's donated, I believe, over $1 million in total to different Republican causes, both at the state level and nationally. He's donated to, I think, a Trump election PAC, some of the local gubernatorial races, things like that. And for folks of the other political persuasion, that's definitely rubbed them the wrong way and has occasionally sort of been attributed to Quick Trip. I asked the folks at Quick Trip about that because that reputation is something that you'll find online or even just talking to people about it. And they were kind of quick to point out that Don's donations were his private donations. They weren't company money. The company has given some money to the legislative committees, both on the left and the right, with a bit more going to the right. But it's nowhere near Don's private donations. And then one thing that the folks I talked to at the company pointed out when I asked about this was that Scott, who is now the CEO, Don's son, does not donate to political causes like his father did. So, the company, to an extent, sort of distances itself from that political activity. But yeah, it's certainly, if you look online about Quick Trip, it's something that you're going to see. And yeah, it's definitely affected folks' perception of the company.
Okay, so my big question for you is, why aren't there any Quick Trips in Milwaukee? I felt a little bit of FOMO learning about people's experiences at Quick Trip.
Yeah, that was a big question that we had deciding to do this story. Because, yeah, there aren't any. The nearest, as of last I checked, was in West Allis. And I asked them about that. And according to them, the rationale is because they have this really big fresh food program and that requires more space. They require, I believe, a minimum of a 3-acre lot for every Quick Trip. And according to them, that's not cost effective in metropolitan areas. So they don't plan on opening one in Milwaukee. I mean, if you look online, folks speculate that, maybe it has something to do with their right-leaning company history, that, obviously Milwaukee's an urban center that's been blue for decades. And so folks have thought maybe that's a factor. One thing that could possibly play into it is that many Quick Trips also sell alcohol. And Milwaukee, if I remember right, has an ordinance that prevents gas stations from also selling alcohol, which could be a factor in deterring Quick Trip from opening within the city.
So, Archer, before we wrap up, I wanted to mention that you reviewed some Quick Trip food items in your feature, and I thought I'd end by asking you the best thing you tried and the very worst. So, let's start with the best thing.
Yeah, definitely. Probably the most fun part of the whole story. And it wasn't just me. We had a bunch of folks from the MilMag offices trying different Quick Trip foods. But the best, in my opinion, was the maple waffle breakfast sandwich. I mean, I love a good breakfast sandwich to begin with. But yeah, this was like genuinely good in a way that you wouldn't expect for something you picked up while, getting gas in the morning.
And what about the worst?
Unfortunately, I have to say the grilled cheese that we tried was not great. Very sort of coagulated, not quite the the melt factor that you want in a grilled cheese. That was probably the most disappointing of the ones we tried.
Well, Archer, thank you so much for speaking with me today and sharing your work with me.
Yeah, thank you.
Archer Parquette is the managing editor at Milwaukee Magazine. He spoke with Lake Effect's Excrit Nunez in November. That's when his article about Quick Trip was featured in Milwaukee Magazine. And that's Lake Effect for today. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. If you've missed any of Lake Effect this week, you can find all of our conversations at wuwm.com. If you'd like to take us on the go, just download the Lake Effect podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Tomorrow on Lake Effect, we'll explore the need for more affordable childcare in Wisconsin and what some potential solutions are. Plus, we'll look at the history of Milwaukee's movie palaces. Thank you so much for joining us today, right here on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.